I'm Eric R. Christoph of Christoph.io, and welcome to my quick little video explaining my summer project, a Pedestal arcade and PC gaming cabinet. I'll go over some considerations as to why I chose a Pedestal and what components will hopefully make it into the final version, along with quick introductions to the major software pieces and the functions they perform. You can see I've got a foam board prototype already set up here, which I highly recommend if you're not exactly sure of your control layout or you want to test the electronics wiring. So why a pedestal cabinet instead of an upright arcade cabinet? For me, it's about size and flexibility. I live in an apartment and I didn't want a full cabinet taking up room. With a pedestal cabinet, pedestal meaning it's not directly attached to any display, I can move it from room to room or utilize a wall-mounted display to reduce the footprint of the entire system. I'm also going to attempt, with a larger LCD TV than you're seeing here, to use a rotating mount so I can fill the entire screen with games that utilize the classic vertical arcade game aspect ratio. Why 4 players? Well, most of the time, you'll probably be playing your arcade game with one person at the controls at a time, or possibly 2 players at the same time. After that, the number of games that would require 3 or 4 players at once drops off dramatically, let alone that I'll be the one using it the most often. So why 4? Well, quite simply, why not? I just wanted to see if I could do it. However, I'd recommend against building a 4-player cabinet if you're on the fence about it. Maybe just consider hooking up some Xbox controllers for players 3 and 4 instead. Why a secondary display? To be honest, you don't need a secondary display. But I liked the idea of displaying high score tables, marquee art, instructions, manuals, maps, control layouts, and a dedicated pause screen to view screenshots or perform save and load functions, while leaving the primary display with just a slight fade in and out. This one is all about eye candy. Since I'm hoping to have a large LCD display against the wall for gaming, I've opted to embed the secondary display inside the cabinet itself. Speaking of eye candy, I'm a fan of LED projects, especially from a currently shelved hobby of RC airplane night flying. Programming LED patterns and colors into an Arduino board, or in the arcade's case, the LED Blinky application, is the eye candy icing on the cake. I hope to have specific LEDs light up on specific buttons used to play the game depending on the system it's currently emulating. As I'm using RGB LEDs, I can change not only the brightness of each individual control, I can also change the color. This project is already becoming a bit of a beast from these aesthetic design choices alone. It's what is known as a Frankenpanel, as it's trying to be a lot of things all in one unit. But at the end of the day, it's my system, and as long as I'm happy with it, and anyone that tries their luck on some gaming here enjoys it, then the project is a success. Now that we've covered some of the primary aesthetic choices, let's talk about how I imagine the hardware and software laid out on this rig. As I'll be using this system for some PC gaming, along with console emulation, I opted for Windows 10 to allow some of my favorite PC games to play directly on the system. At least this way, I'm fighting a known quantity compared to trying to emulate my PC games on a Linux machine. The controls are going to be wired into 2 OptiPack controllers from Ultimark. These controllers will emulate keyboard presses after I've configured all the pins with Ultimark's setup utility. They also allow the spinners and trackball to be attached to the system as mice. Controlling the LED eye candy will be accomplished through 2 Ultimark PAC-LED 64 LED boards. Hopefully all of these controls play nicely, and in future videos and articles, I'll go through each step of configuration to share with anyone interested, as well as serve as my own personal reference. The core of this system is, of course, the emulator. The emulator allows the PC I'll be using in this system to emulate a console's hardware and behavior for the purpose of gameplay. The idea is that you use an emulator to play much older games on current hardware. Video game emulators utilize stored binary data of floppy disk images, hard drive images, CD-ROM drive images, and chipset dumps called ROMs to emulate a video game. If you search hard enough, you'll find public domain or free for non-commercial use games to play on a lot of emulators. Of course, depending on the system emulated, these files vary in size and complexity. There are so many emulators out there, just too many to list on this high-level overview. Nevertheless, I'll probably utilize 3 well-known multi-system emulators, MAME, DOSBox, and RetroArch, for the majority of my gameplay. I'm also listing virtual machines here, as I have a feeling I'll be grabbing my old Windows 95 or Windows 98 disks to create a retro Windows install so I can play a small subset of my old games I still want to enjoy, but simply can't get to execute on Windows 10 to my satisfaction. For each of these emulators, I know I'll have a lot of controller configuration to work through. It's going to be tedious but necessary, as each emulator needs to know what key press actions, supplied by my OptiPack controllers, perform the desired game action. For example, if MAME expects the up arrow to move your game character up on the screen, I'll need to make sure I've mapped the OptiPack joystick up pin to the same key press action. I'll also probably spend some time configuring shaders supported by the given emulators. A shader is an emulator component that can simulate CRT raster lines, making a LCD display almost look like a genuine old-school CRT monitor. Shaders can also help overcome the extreme levels of pixelation that occurs when running low-res games on a high-res screen. So I'll be curious to see how genuine I can get old games to look on modern technology without looking too blocky on a larger display. Of course, if I set up all these emulators, I'll have to find the launcher for each emulator, use the emulator's specific loading functionality to find the game to play, and finally start gaming. That gets tedious after a short while, and thankfully that void is filled through what we call a front end. It's meant to be the single point of entry for browsing, selecting, and launching the right emulator against your chosen game. While a lot of emulators have their own internal front end, if you're using more than one emulator, you'll probably want a front end that can be configured for whatever launch commands your emulators need. For this effort, I've chosen Hyperspin, though there are plenty of excellent multi-emulator front ends out there, like GameX and Launchbox. I've chosen Hyperspin this time around, as I'm on Windows and Hyperspin has a lot of built-in functionality to handle all that eye candy that we covered before, like the LED lighting and marquee artwork on the second display. Setting up any front end, depending on what systems and games you want to play, is not a trivial operation. I definitely recommend playing with multiple front ends to see which one you like best. Keeping with the eye candy aspirations, I'll be scouring for marquee artwork goodness for that secondary display, as well as gameplay videos to be used in Hyperspin while browsing my game list. In essence, the front end emulates what is called attract mode, pulling your attention to play a game by showing example gameplay and flashy graphics. With all of these emulators and all of my old software going on this cabinet, I'll definitely need some utilities to help manage the collection. These utilities won't be just for organizing the game files themselves, but all of that metadata that the front ends and emulators need to know about. For example, since Hyperspin has so many themes out there for so many of the games, there are dedicated utilities that show which games you have all that eye candy media for and which ones you're missing. Now that we're getting into some more advanced topics of Project Pedestal, we go back into Hyperspin for two utilities available for it: the Event Dispatcher System and Hyper Marquee. These are vital for getting that secondary display to display marquee artwork and set the RGB LED colors appropriately. By default, Hyperspin supports the LED Blinky software integration to change your LED colors and brightness, but that's all it can do. Thankfully, a Hyperspin forum member named Antos has created the Event Dispatcher System for Hyperspin. This greatly extends the functionality of Hyperspin by sitting in between Hyperspin and LED Blinky along with Hyper Marquee, allowing you to control multiple applications through Hyperspin events. This will allow an action in Hyperspin, for example, browsing a game list, to control both LED colors and the marquee art displayed on the secondary display through Hyper Marquee. Hyper Marquee will allow you to configure the size and placement of multiple media windows that can populate with your artwork, game titles, high score lists, box art, and more based on the current game you selected in Hyperspin. While the Event Dispatcher System and Hyper Marquee are geared towards Hyperspin integration, in the future I might try and see how I can integrate that into other front ends as an advanced research topic. So what the hell is going on with a dedicated launcher? I thought that's what my front end was supposed to handle. Yeah, it's true. The typical functionality of the front end is to configure how your emulator is launched to play your chosen game. However, the dedicated launcher component that sits between your emulators and front end does serve a purpose in an advanced setup. The idea of the dedicated launcher, in our case Rocket Launcher, is one of separation of concerns. Let the front end handle the aesthetics of your retro gaming system, such as flashy menus and eye candy. Let the emulators handle what they're meant to handle, emulation. So the dedicated launcher is the middle layer that joins the two, a piece of software with plugins that know how to configure and launch emulators while at the same time understanding a front end's data structure. It's not necessary for a retro gaming system, but for an advanced setup it can be very useful. Some examples of what a dedicated launcher can serve across all of your emulation activity: a dedicated pause menu with consistent look and feel. As this sits on top of the emulators, it can, in essence, take over the screen and pause each emulator in a consistent fashion. You can have dedicated admin buttons for exit and pause, and they'll be the same regardless of what emulator you're using, since you control the dedicated launcher, and the dedicated launcher knows how to talk to each unique emulator. Save and load game state from the pause menu. If your emulator supports saving and loading your game state between your gaming sessions, the dedicated launcher handles the specifics for you. You just simply select save or load. You can also browse the game metadata, manuals, artwork, videos, all of that. And with a dedicated pause screen on the second monitor, I can browse and look up all that great nostalgic game information. So there you have it. That's the end goal. It's not going to be as quick and easy as it might sound, and I know I'll stumble into quite a few spots, and a lot of testing and reworking comes with this territory. It'll take a decent amount of time and effort for me to configure a system as advanced as this, but it'll probably also never end, and I think if I can at least get most of these pieces working for most of the games I want to play, that'll be good enough for me. As a personal project is more a labor of love than it is of profit. If I don't have some sort of fun and challenge out of it, then I shouldn't be doing it in the first place. I'll have more on the website as these pieces start coming together. That's the whole pedestal design itself that hasn't even been covered here, and how I'm still daydreaming of how I want the cabinet hardware itself to look. Painted, decals, artwork, all that. I'm also slightly dreading the woodworking, but this time I'll have some assistance to make sure I can play these games later on with all 10 of my fingers. Until next time, this is Eric R. Christoph, signing off.